required between Schiphol Airport and Rotterdam.
A post-industrial nightmare. Totalitarian, dark, underside, greed of Western society gone mad. The secret nature of perception, it all seemed to fit.
You know what?
It all seemed to
I'm
fit.
so happy for your success, but I'll get right into it. We have a lot of viewers calling in as of late, asking why you're off your social media platforms. You know, we find it so weird for such a successful artist to be not present in that aspect.
Yeah, it's been a little bit of a journey. Obviously, I can find ways to connect with my fans, but I think the biggest reason for that, it was a personal reason. My friend is an author, and she just came out with a new book called The Surveillance Capitalism, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, I should say. It's by my friend Shoshana Zuboff. And it's a crazy book. I definitely recommend it. It definitely changed my perspective on social media and our information that we put out on the web these days.
Wow. When you put it that way, honestly, it sounds kind of creepy, not gonna lie. Would you care to elaborate on that?
Yeah. So Google and Facebook and Microsoft, all these big Silicon Valley companies, the way they operate and the way they handle our information is a big cause of concern for me. And ever since I read this book, I gained so much insight on very specific topics in this realm of technology and whatnot, but also the bigger picture. Like, I'm talking about these big companies taking our information legally within the fine prints of the products that we buy that are in the mainstream, and we are so sort of accustomed to them. And within these fine prints, they find ways to legally take our information and sell it and auction it off to other companies for sales and to generate this sort of behavioral modification complex, which is scary, right?
Seriously, you might be scaring a few of our viewers off here. I was just wondering, how deep are we in this information vacuum, so to speak?
Yeah, so I'll put it to you this way. In one part of the book, she talks about how she mentions how Eric Schmidt, this former head of Google, he came out and said a few years ago that the internet will disappear. That's the future of the internet. And of course, that's taken with a grain of salt. What essentially he meant, and what Shoshana really breaks down in the book, is that it will become so morphed in our daily lives that we essentially forget about the actions that we sort of take for granted. We forget about those actions that we used to take, like, for example, like touching our phone screen. Right now it's still a mechanical thing, but hey, 10 years from now, who knows? It could be engraved like a chip in our brains or something like that, which is, a little bit scary, of course, but no, it's a reality. Right now, as we speak, these big companies are acquiring smaller companies, startups, and in that process, they are taking all the information that those companies are holding within their databases about their consumers, and they're acquiring that information alongside the physical infrastructures of the company. So it's like, so to speak, intellectual property, I guess. And that's very frightening for a lot of consumers out there who don't know that they're, essentially being exploited. And, like, think of the turn of the 20th century with mass production, with Henry Ford. Henry Ford was a guy who came in and introduced this model of how to produce, you lower your costs, maximize your output, and this comparison could be made with this new surveillance age of capitalism, where it's just unprecedented. Before, in Ford's time, it was unprecedented to have such a big output with, as little input as he did. and he's obviously the father of mass production or whatever. People have their views about him, some negative, some positive. But regardless, what he did was tap into a whole new era of capitalism. What's happening right now should be somewhat alarming, because this is also unprecedented. We've never had this amount of technology be available and be flooding our lives. And I just think the real meat and potatoes of this book was that she really went deep and sort of painted this larger picture that we don't often think about, because it's never really portrayed on the media or any sort of social platform or anything, is that think about how much information and knowledge these companies possess over us and how little we have on our own surroundings and them. So the landscape of information and knowledge and data is so uneven now. It's more uneven than ever before. So this has some real troubling implications for the future. Like, we're talking about these companies are growing at such a rapid pace, and to the point where they're going to be worth more than countries. I think they already are. And this is dangerous when you put so much power in the hands of so few people at the top of these companies. It's scary. Even internally, like in the book, she talks about how the employees, they have this feeling of, like there's some internal conflicts within these companies about privacy, the invasion of privacy issues, and how these employees are essentially, just so exploited, just like the rest of us. So essentially what that means is the guy at the top is the guy who's benefiting from all this kind of stuff, and they're actually micromanaging their own employees with that data, right? So that is sort of the biggest troubling part. And also she goes in and analyzes how, as a society, we're going to be very conditioned by these big players. She goes in and says, okay, like these politicians and these old sort of folks that aren't going to be around for the upcoming 3-4 decades, these guys, they already cannot even keep up with the pace that these technological companies are growing at. And they don't even understand, they can't even grasp the different ways that these companies can interfere with society as a whole. And the basically the take-home message is, we as a society need to make our voice heard. Otherwise, we're going to spiral down into an Orwellian state, and we're going to be basically, almost mind controlled in a certain sense. Like, not directly, obviously, but sort of indirectly. And basically, what she calls out for towards the end of the book is just like with the Berlin Wall, when East Germany said, "No more. We want our voice heard. We want to be a part of the rest of what's going on." We have to do the same. We have to be the people who say, okay, there are boundaries, there are restrictions. Facebook cannot alter humanity. Facebook cannot change the course of history. They can't modify human nature. And if they do, there will be trouble. And that's essentially why I just realized, I'm just blacking out of social media. I don't want to have a device in my house that records everything I do, gives it to whatever company that wants to sell me something, gives it to my government. I don't feel comfortable with that. And we have to take a stand as the people and make our voice heard and make sure we stay human for the years to come. So that's why I'm off social media.
Yeah, that definitely answers our questions for the listeners out there. That being said, folks, we are going to take a little break here on KC93 Smooth Jazz Radio.
And then there was the theme of George Orwell, who published his book in 1948 called 1984. And look around you. the Orwellian state is, global state, is unfolding. Then you look at Aldous Huxley, Brave New World, published in 1932. Look around you. It's unfolding what he, in his novel, said was going to happen. And you can pick up these themes and these indications all over the place, if you research deeply enough, of how the way the world has gone and where it's going and what is happening today is not random. It's coldly, carefully planned.
You know, I think the larger project here, and the reason why I call this new market form surveillance capitalism, is that its mechanisms are designed to be hidden, that it's a backstage operation. Its mechanisms are designed to keep us in ignorance. And the result of that is that even though it's something unprecedented, it's very hard for us to detect it in our midst. And so my aim has been to unveil piece by piece the actual mechanisms, what it is, how it works, why it strives to remain hidden and secret, why our ignorance is its bliss, if you will.
I want to talk today about another example of that. It was a document I came across very early on in my research, which started around 25 years ago. And it's called Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars. And what it is, Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars, it's a manual for people who have come into the cabal, shall we say, or to work for the conspiracy to take us into this Orwellian state. It's a manual explaining how you manipulate the population through silent weapons. And silent weapons are different expressions of social engineering.
Well, a lot of people have, you know, in the sense of unease that we have with the direction that the digital has taken under surveillance capitalism. People know that, you know, we're being monitored and we're being tracked, and, you know, there's a lot of reference to Big Brother and a lot of reference to concepts like digital totalitarianism. And I thought it was important to really ask the question, what is the kind of power that surveillance capitalism produces? Because really, it's not a totalitarian power. Totalitarianism is a form of power based on, first of all, terror, murder. Totalitarianism aimed to control individuals from the inside out. It wanted you to believe what it wanted you to believe, and it wanted to control your thoughts and your feelings and your emotions, and it wanted you to conform to everything that it held as ideologically correct and necessary, and it was willing to murder you on the way to that conformity, and, you know, purging the human species for the sake of this kind of perfection inside and out. The kind of power that's created by surveillance capitalism is really very, very different. What I found interesting is that when totalitarian burst upon the world in the 1930s and 40s, it was also an unprecedented form of power. People couldn't recognize it in their midst because it was so unprecedented, so bizarre. Its demands and claims were so unimaginable and intolerable that really people couldn't get their arms around it or believe that it was even real until the evidence of the murder and the terror and the gulags and the concentration camps and so forth. Well, the kind of power that's created by surveillance capitalism is equally unprecedented, but not with the same kind of violence. It's a much more subtle and abstract kind of violence. But because of its unprecedented nature, it has also been very challenging to perceive, to name, to grasp, to understand, to predict. And so this has been a big part of my work, to try and fill in those blanks. The nature of instrumentarian power, since you bring up radical indifference, is that it's a power that is used to really shape, tune, herd the behavior of individuals and populations toward the kinds of commercial outcomes that surveillance capitalists and their business customers seek. And it uses the instrumentation of the ubiquitous digital architecture that now surrounds us in our daily lives. It uses that instrumentation as the means to a sort of global capability for behavioral modification that can push us and herd us and shunt us in the direction that it wants us to go for the sake of its commercial outcomes. But the thing is here that it doesn't care what we do. It doesn't care what we believe. It doesn't care what we feel. It doesn't care if we are in great pain. It doesn't care if we are experiencing great joy. All it cares about is that whatever we are doing, whatever we are thinking, whatever forms of action we are taking, that we are doing those things in ways that it can capture the behavioral data from those activities, translate those behavioral data into predictions, sell those predictions into new markets that trade exclusively in behavioral futures, in predictions of what we will do now, soon, and later, sell those to its business customers who have a vested interest in knowing our future behavior. So this is a completely different direction where our behavior becomes simply instrumentalized on the way to achieving commercial outcomes for business customers interested in the future of our behavior. And this is the essence of instrumentarian power, and I call this radical indifference.
If you are going to control billions of people, then you can't do it physically. There's too many of them compared with you, even with your jackboots in uniform. There's too many. You have to manipulate and program the perceptions of the population, the perceptions of themselves and the perception of the reality and world events, so that they will then act and respond in a way that suits your agenda and allows this Orwellian nightmare to unfold.
And I call this radical indifference because instrumentarian power's attitude toward us, its point of view, if you will, is a point of view where it really doesn't care about us. It just cares that it has access to the data that leaches from our activities, that it can use for its predictions. And the result of that is what I call radical indifference. There was a memo that was produced by a Facebook executive named Andy Bosworth that was released accidentally at some point just a little over a year or two ago, where he was actually coaching his team on what I would call the operations of radical indifference. And the way he put it was, the economic imperative for Facebook is growth. Growth comes from connection. And I'm paraphrasing, of course, because I'm not reading this memo right now. But essentially he said, look, if people connect on Facebook and they use that connection to create a terrorist plot and people get killed, we continue to connect because connection is growth, and that's our life. If people use connection on Facebook to fall in love and get married and live happily ever after, we continue to connect because connection is growth, and growth is our imperative. So here he's illustrating the point of view of radical indifference. It may lead to terror and death. It may lead to love and happiness. We can't care about that. We don't care about the content of behavior, the content of connection, the content of what happens on our platform. All we care about is the fact of connection, that we get the data from all of that connection, because that's the data that drives economic growth for Facebook as a premier surveillance capitalist. So Bosworth was acting as a very responsible, accountable, excellent surveillance capitalist, and beautifully illustrating the point of view of surveillance capitalism, which is radical indifference.
Silent Weapons was dated May 1979 and was apparently found in a copier at a surplus sale in 1986 by a employee of Boeing. And when you find that in the 1980s and you look at what it says, people can say, well, someone's just made this up. So the proof of its genuineness and validity is, does what it says in there occur as the years go past? Well, this is how the manual described the nature and the consequences of this perception manipulation that is going on globally.
I would define surveillance capitalism this way for our listeners. There are many respects in which surveillance capitalism diverges from the history of market capitalism. But in this one respect that's essential to its definition, it follows in the pattern of how capitalism has evolved over the centuries. And historians have described this process as capitalism continuously claims things that live outside of the market dynamic, and it drags them into the market dynamic, converts them into commodities that can be sold and purchased. So famously, industrial capitalism claimed nature. Nature lives in its own time and space. The meadows, the waters, the oceans, the forests lives in its own time and space. But industrial capitalism claimed nature for the industrial dynamic, to have it reborn as real estate, as land, as water that could be sold and purchased in a commodity fashion. And at the time that that happened, that was a radical breakthrough in the whole structure of life. Also, industrial capitalism took the idea of work, which was something that people did in their homes, in their gardens, in their fields, in their cottages. And it brought that into the market dynamic to be reborn as labor that could be sold and purchased in the marketplace. Surveillance capitalism does something similar, but now with a kind of dark twist. And what it does is it claims private human experience as a source of free raw material which is translated into behavioral data. Those data then combined with advanced computational capabilities, the dark satanic mills, if you will, of surveillance capitalism, what we call machine learning, machine intelligence, artificial intelligence, combined with these computational capabilities in order to produce predictions of our future behavior. This began in the context of online targeted advertising, and the specific behavior that they wanted to predict was whether or not we would click through a particular ad. Well, that's a piece of human behavior, clicking. Maybe trivial in the larger scheme of things, online clicking, but their aim was to predict that bit of behavior. And those online targeted ad markets, if you just zoom out a little bit, those were markets where people were trading in these behavioral futures. Who's going to click on my ad? If I put my ad where they tell me to, will I get the click-through rates? So they're betting on future human behavior. And this became the essence, the mechanisms of the economic logic that is surveillance capitalism. Begun at Google, migrated to Facebook, became the default option in Silicon Valley, and is now migrating across many sectors of our economy, many different industries. So it now has a life of its own, and it should not be confused with either one company like Google or two companies like Google and Facebook. It's in the insurance industry, it's in the retail industry, it's in the healthcare industry, it's now in the automotive industry. It's a kind of virus that is, spreading through these different sectors and transforming each sector as it moves through. And early on, the competitive dynamic in this new logic is around the quality of prediction. So what's going to come out of that black box of this computational machinery that tells us what people are going to do now, soon, and later?
Silent weapons was dated May 1979. This is how the manual described the nature and the consequences of this perception manipulation that is going on globally. Everything that is expected from an ordinary weapon is expected from a silent weapon by its creators, but only in its own manner of functioning. It shoots situations instead of bullets. Manipulate the situation, like I talk about problem, reaction, solution. Create the problem. Get the public to see the problem in the way that you've told them to see it, and then they will react by allowing solutions to that problem to occur that they would possibly have protested against and resisted had that problem not been manipulated into place in the first place. It's propelled, talking about silent weapons, it's propelled by data processing instead of chemical reaction, explosion, originating from bits of data instead of grains of gunpowder, from a computer instead of a gun, operated by a computer programmer instead of a marksman, under the orders of a banking magnate instead of a military general. It makes no obvious explosive noises, causes no obvious physical or mental injuries, and does not obviously interfere with anyone's daily social life. Yet, the document says, the silent weapons make an unmistakable noise, cause unmistakable physical and mental damage, and unmistakably interferes with the daily social life, i.e., unmistakable to a trained observer, one who knows what to look for. And as we go deeper into this, we'll see how the world is constantly being manipulated in terms of perception by manufactured events and manufactured, if you like, causes, which are designed to have a response or an effect to the cause. And in doing that, and it's done in a scientific way, based on fantastic data that they gather and then process to see if you do that, what will happen then. You see that the world that we think is random and is just happening by chance is unbelievably, in its depth, manipulated on purpose. The document says the public cannot comprehend this weapon and therefore cannot believe that they are being attacked and subdued by a weapon. Most people would never even think that their minds are being manipulated daily, minute by minute, to perceive the world and self in a certain way.
So what's going to come out of that black box of this computational machinery that tells us what people are going to do now, soon, and later? And early on, the competition for predictions began to delineate a new kind of economic imperative. And there were several of these economic imperatives. And the first, of course, was scale, that you needed a lot of behavioral data in order to make powerful predictions. So you need volume of these behavioral data flows. But again, as competition heated up, pretty soon volume was not enough. And now it also became variation. So you need both scale and scope. You need a lot of behavioral data, but you need different kinds of behavioral data. So now we're going to get you offline. I'm going to give you a mobile phone at the least possible cost so that there is no friction presented to the continuous flow of behavioral data. So that Android has to be understood as simply a supply chain interface for behavioral data. And it was debated within Google. Some people said, gee, now we have a way of competing with Apple and with the iPhone, and we can make money on our devices and have margins on our devices, and we don't have to make all our money on data. But other people said, no, 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 because we have discovered this powerful logic that is just driving unbelievable volumes of revenue growth. And so what we want to do is lower every single barrier to the flow of behavioral data. So the voices that won in this debate were the voices that said, hey, if we could give Android away for free, let's do that. Because all it is a supply chain interface for behavioral data that goes with you wherever you are in the world, your voice, your camera, your contacts, all the stuff on your phone, but also your location, where you're going, who you're going with, what you're doing, what restaurant you're entering, and so on and so forth. Ultimately, your face, your voice, all these other ways of getting depth, insight into you from the more emotional, personality-related characteristics of yourself. So now we have economies of scale and economies of scope. But prediction competition continues. More people coming on stream, more people searching for these behavioral data, more people trying to get a dominant position in these new prediction markets. So the next horizon, as it were, becomes something that really is new under the sun. Economies of scale, economies of scope. This next one I call economies of action. And the idea here is that the very best predictive data comes from actually intervening in the state of play and finding ways to use, as we said before, the digital surround, all the instrumentation in the digital milieu, what people talk about as ubiquitous computing, to use all of this instrumentation to usually, gently, nudge, coax, tune, herd, subliminally shape and modify your behavior in the direction that we want you to go to fulfill our commercial goals and the commercial goals of our customers in these behavioral futures markets. So the very most powerful means of predicting is to actually be shaping your behavior. And this is when the digital architecture that now pervades our lives, our daily lives, has been repurposed as a global means of behavioral modification. And this has resurrected an old paradigm of behavioral modification that really our societies rejected in the 1960s and the 1970s, when the great leaders of behavioral modification, like the scientist, my former professor at Harvard, B.F. Skinner, considered the father of radical behaviorism.
Silent Weapons was dated May 1979. This is how the manual described the nature and the consequences of this perception manipulation that is going on globally. Everything that is expected from an ordinary weapon is expected from a silent weapon by its creators, but only in its own manner of functioning. It shoots situations instead of bullets. Manipulate the situation, like I talk about problem, reaction, solution, create the problem, get the public to see the problem in the way that you've told them to see it, and then they will react by allowing solutions to that problem to occur that they would possibly have protested against and resisted had that problem not been manipulated into place in the first place. It's propelled, talking about silent weapons, It's propelled by data processing instead of chemical reaction explosion, originating from bits of data instead of grains of gunpowder, from a computer instead of a gun, operated by a computer programmer instead of a marksman, under the orders of a banking magnate instead of a military general. It makes no obvious explosive noises, causes no obvious physical or mental injuries, and does not obviously interfere with anyone's daily social life. Yet, the document says, the silent weapons make an unmistakable noise, cause unmistakable physical and mental damage, and unmistakably interferes with the daily social life, i.e., unmistakable to a trained observer, one who knows what to look for. And as we go deeper into this, we'll see how the world is constantly being manipulated in terms of perception by manufactured events and manufactured, if you like, causes which are designed to have a response or an effect to the cause. And in doing that, and it's done in a scientific way based on fantastic data that they gather and then process to see if you do that, what will happen then. You see that the world that we think is random and is just happening by chance is unbelievably, in its depth, manipulated on purpose. The document says the public cannot comprehend this weapon and therefore cannot believe that they are being attacked and subdued by a weapon. Most people would never even think that their minds are being manipulated daily, minute by minute, to perceive the world and self in a certain way.
And this has resurrected an old paradigm of behavioral modification that really our societies rejected in the 1960s and the 1970s, when the great leaders of behavioral modification, like the scientist, my former professor at Harvard, B.F. Skinner, considered the father of radical behaviorism.
Well, this is the incarnation of that, the economic incarnation.
This is the economic incarnation of that, now on the scale of whole populations.
There's a great quote of B.F. Skinner's. I don't know if I got it from your book. It is not a matter of bringing the world into the laboratory, but of extending the practices of an experimental science to the world at large.
Yes, I do cite that in the book. And that is exactly the reversal that we've been through here, where in the 60s and 70s, behavioral modification was being applied to captive audiences in prisons and hospitals and schools, and there was a wide congressional Senate inquiry. The American people were up in arms rejecting these practices. An auspicious group of senators that formed this committee included Edward Kennedy and Sam Erwin and some very famous senators, came down on this and finally concluded that behavioral modification was an affront to the ideal of the autonomous individual, which was essential for democracy, and an affront to democratic society itself. And they forbade any kind of federal funding to go to any kind of program that used behavioral modification on its populations. Now, we fast forward a few decades later, and here we have, under the auspices of private capital, private surveillance capital, the entire digital infrastructure for which, as we began our conversation about home, for which most of us harbored so much hope for an empowered and democratic future. This entire digital architecture now is being hijacked by a new form of capitalism, a mutation of capitalism, a rogue capitalism that uses the digital now as a global means of behavioral modification for the narrow commercial ends of others, not us. Business customers, not the people whose behavior and experience is at stake. Our problems are not being solved. Our problems are simply being instrumentalized for the sake of others' commercial gain.
Does it feel like we're sort of getting entangled, enmeshed in this architecture that is being driven by this economic logic of surveillance capitalism?
It's very interesting the way you bring this up, because as I've been going around talking to groups of people on this subject, I'm finding the same kind of pattern over and over again, where people talk about a sense of anxiety, an unease, a loss of control, a feeling of manipulation, concerns about freedom, concerns about sovereignty, a sense that they need to resist, but not really having a clear grasp of what to resist or how or whom. And so it's this kind of foggy, amorphous, cloudy thing that is closing in around us, that's making us feel anxious and uneasy, like things are not okay.
The document says the public cannot comprehend this weapon and therefore cannot believe that they are being attacked and subdued by a weapon. Most people would never even think that their minds are being manipulated daily, minute by minute, to perceive the world and self in a certain way. The public might instinctively feel that something is wrong. Now, isn't that true? But what? But what? And the idea is to use the silent weapons of social engineering without allowing people to realize how they're being manipulated. Thus, they instinctively think, well, something's not right, but they can't grasp what it is that's not right. The public might instinctively feel that something is wrong, but because of the technical nature of the silent weapon, they cannot express their feeling in a rational way or handle the problem with intelligence. Therefore, they don't know how to cry for help and don't know who and how to associate with others to defend themselves against it. When a silent weapon is applied gradually, very relevant this is, the public adjusts, adapts to its presence and learns to tolerate its encroachment on their lives until the pressure, brackets psychological via economic, here we go, economic crashes, austerity, becomes too great and they crack up.
More and more we feel like we have to hide from it, but how to hide, where to hide. And the response that I'm getting with the work on surveillance capitalism is that here finally we have a way of naming this thing that we're entangled in. And just in the idea of naming, being able to see it clearly, being able to discern its mechanisms, being able to perceive the logic, see how it operates, see how it functions, even though it doesn't change it immediately, it completely changes the experience of it.
When a silent weapon is applied gradually, the public adjusts, adapts to its presence. I mean, if you took today's society and you had imposed it upon the people in the 1950s and the 1960s, just like that, overnight, what's happening? What's going on? The world's gone crazy. But because it's been done in steps, each step, well, I don't like this, it's Big Brother, you know, it's Big Brother gone mad. And then suddenly, well, now it's the norm. So now the gate opens and we go on to the next. Oh, I'm not sure about this. And well, there's only a few people saying I'm not sure about this, because what the system's doing while they're pushing the gate open, they're saying, hey, have you seen the football scores today? You know, have you seen what's happening in the soap? What? Yeah. What about the latest crap by Simon Cowell? Have you watched that? Yeah, I'm watching it. Yeah, okay, well, we'll just walk through this gate while you're watching that. And this is how the whole social engineering thing works.
Because once we can name it and once we have language about it, we start to be empowered and we start to be able to see where it ends and where we begin. And we start to be able to imagine a space in which there can be resistance and where there can be combat, and we can come together and talk and name and develop our bonds of collective action that can, you know, reinstate some kind of form of combat that we have been robbed of.
And it says here, therefore the silent weapon is a type of biological warfare. It is. It's a warfare on a war on our perception. It attacks the vitality, options, and mobility of the individuals of a society by knowing, understanding, manipulating, and attacking their sources of natural and social energy and their physical, mental, and emotional strengths and weaknesses. And one of the greatest ways that they target emotional strengths and weaknesses is by constantly giving people something to fear. Fear whether they're going to have a home at the end of the month. Fear if they're going to have a job. Fear if they're going to be attacked by terrorists. Fear of this disease or whatever that they throw out through the media to frighten us. All the time. Fear, fear, fear. And when people are in a state of fear, they almost always look out of themselves, outside of themselves, to find protection from what they've been manipulated to fear. And so here's more power to the state, here's more power to the uniforms, here's more power to the dark suits, because they will protect me from what they, in total, have persuaded me to fear.
Precisely because these mechanisms, look, so much capital has been devoted to ensuring that these mechanisms are invisible. So much skill has been devoted to making sure that the rhetoric in this space of surveillance capitalism is misleading and rendered as though it was an inevitable consequence of digital technology. So it's laden with euphemism, with the rhetoric of emancipation, with very artfully employed misdirection, telling us it's one thing when it's really another thing. Masses of engineering, skill, and capital devoted to making sure that these mechanisms operate in a way that consistently, comprehensively bypasses individual awareness, so that our ignorance is engineered by these vast accumulations of capital and skill that are now trained on our experience. So out of all of that, we have been robbed of the right to combat. We have been robbed of our decision rights. We have been robbed of a choice to participate or not. And indeed, every single piece of research going back to the early 2000s shows that when people are informed of the nature of these backstage operations, they want nothing to do with them. They do not want to be entangled. They want to be protected. But more and more, as surveillance capital has come to own and operate almost all of the spaces of the internet, there is no place to go. There is no place to escape. The alternatives have been foreclosed, and therefore our means of social participation, just the basic kinds of things we need to do every day, whether it's getting our health data from our physician or getting our grades from our children's teachers or making arrangements with our friends and family for dinner, just the basics of social participation force us to march through the same channels that are surveillance capitalism supply chains. So social participation and surveillance capitalism are increasingly conflated, and the alternatives are foreclosed, and therefore we feel resigned and we feel helpless, and racing around all of this, as you've already hinted at, is a larger category error that has been imposed on us, and that's the idea that this is the only way that digital can be.
This point that we're made to believe that what we encounter today is technology. It isn't surveillance capitalism.
It's not economics. It's technology.
And that's the wolf in sheep's clothing. That's the puppeteer behind the puppet. The puppet is the technology. The puppeteer are the surveillance capitalists.
That's right. The puppet is this whole milieu of digital instrumentation.
That doesn't have to be governed by this type of
that
logic.
Can be anything we want it to be.
Right.
And it was, Dimitri, it was.
I agree. I mean, I remember what the 1990s was like.
That's
It was
right.
nothing like
there was
this.
a window before surveillance capitalism broke upon the public imagination when Google was finally IPO'd in 2004, and we got a chance to see the incredible revenues that flowed from this economic logic in just a few short years. Between 2000 and 2004, Google's revenue line increased by 3,590%.
That's a remarkable
That's just
number.
astonishing, and that was on the back of this economic logic.
I mean, it is quite obvious, really, how the power of the manipulation of money is controlling human society. It talks there about it being a banking magnate running all this and not a military general. The money system is actually run as an electronic, energetic construct, like electronic circuitry. And indeed, when you look at it, the more that money you can hold and see goes out of circulation, the more it is literally electronic circuitry. And so Silent Weapons details the financial system at length, and how it's controlled by the system that I've been exposing, and as I say, it mentions Rothschild. This is what it says about money and economics. Economics is only a social extension of a natural energy system. Since energy is the key to all activity on the face of the earth, it follows that in order to attain a monopoly of energy, raw materials, goods and services, and to establish a world system of slave labor, it is necessary to have a first strike capability in the field of economics. It says, in order to maintain our position, it is necessary that we have absolute first knowledge of the science of control over all economic factors and the first experience at engineering the world economy. And what they mean by first experience is we know how it works, but we don't let anyone else, let alone the target population, know how it works. In order to achieve such sovereignty, it says, we must at least achieve this one end, that the public will not make either the logical or mathematical connection between economics and the other energy sciences, or learn to apply such knowledge. It says, to make a short story of it all, it was discovered that an economy obeyed the same laws as electricity, and that all of the mathematical theory and practical and computer know-how developed for the electronic field could directly be applied to the study of economics. It's an electrical construct, which we see as money moving around and changing hands. That's why, because it is a computerized electrical construct, they can make the money go wherever they want it to go, i.e. towards themselves. It says this discovery was not openly declared, and its more subtle implications were and are kept a closely guarded secret. For example, wait for this. For example, that in an economic model, human life is measured in dollars. Is that true or what? And that the electric spark generated when opening a switch is connected to an active inductor. That is mathematically analogous to the initiation of war. And so we're seeing all these things going on that we call world events, but they're just like an electrical system. This has to happen for this to happen, so we see that as a war. But to them, it's part of the economic construct and the manipulation of the economic system, leading to a position which I'm talking about all the time, where you've got a mass of the population, basically all but less than 1%, who are in abject poverty and slavery. Talks in here about slave labor, global slave labor. And then you've got the less than 1% in fantastic luxury. And what is money? It is merely figures on a screen moving around. Theoretically, measuring the wealth of people. And if you control the electrical system, you move those electrical pulses in the direction that you want, and that's how you create a less than 1% with fantastic, unbelievable amounts of wealth. In other words, electrical pulses stored on a database, and you've taken it away from the mass of the population purely by the manipulation of electrical signals. But people don't realize this. They don't see what is happening.
But look, in the year 2000, a group of really smart designers and engineers and data scientists at Georgia Tech published a really interesting big report on what they called the aware home. And that's what today we think of as the smart home. Mm-hmm. And you know, the aware home was going to do all the things that we want a smart home to do today. It was going to, you know, give us data to make our homes more efficient and data about our behavior that could help us with our health and our fitness and so on and so forth. Anyway, when they got down to the schematics for the aware home, the schematics were pretty simple. It was a closed loop, and it was the devices built into the home itself was one node, and the other node were the occupant of the home. And the occupant, or the occupants, those are the only people who receive the data. And they decided if it would be shared or not, and they decided how to make sense of it. They decided what to do with it. It was a simple, closed loop that was empowering. Similarly, in the telemedicine field, telemedicine in the year 2000, 2001, 2002, same goals that we have today, but conceived as a simple closed loop. The physician, a server typically located in a hospital, and the patient at home in her or his bed or bedroom or living room or wherever, you know, a simple closed loop where it was the person who received the data, the person who had the decision rights over those data. Just a couple of years ago, 2017, a couple of scholars at the University of London did an analysis of the Nest thermostat. As you know, Nest owned by Google. And they concluded that for a moderately vigilant consumer to install one Nest thermostat in the home requires that person to review a minimum of 1,000 privacy policies and user contracts and user agreements, because the thermostat, of course, is collecting all kinds of behavioral data. It also becomes a hub for other smart devices in the home that are feeding it with behavioral data. Could be your mattress, could be your dishwasher, could be your television set, could be your stereo system. And then all these data are not only going to Nest, but they're going to Nest third parties. And Nest takes no accountability for what the third parties do. Each third party shunts the data to third parties, and they take no accountability. And those third parties and their third parties and so on and so forth in an infinite regress. And then, of course, it turns out that if you don't agree to these thousands of contracts, you slowly lose the functionality of the product. And Nest warns, maybe the smoke alarm won't work. Maybe you end up with frozen pipes. So the very reason that you bought the thermostat in the first place is obviated, is deleted, because the real point of the thermostat is as a supply chain interface for behavioral data, not to serve your needs in your home, for you, for your family, for your energy costs, for your health, everything else that you had hoped for.
One of the things that the document Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars emphasizes is the need to get maximum data on everybody. It points out that the more data you can get about people, the more control you can have, because the better you understand that if you do that, they will react like that. And what we've got, of course, all these years later, since this was produced and later found, and exposed is staggering levels of data collection on people. I mean, we've seen the Edward Snowden revelations and all the others about the NSA in America. It's going on everywhere, in GCHQ in Britain. And this data, people think that it's only for surveillance. Well, it's surveillance for those that the system is concerned about and wants to know what they're doing because they're starting to suss the system and how it works. But it's also, collectively, it's about taking fantastic amounts of data from people, information from all these different internet and phone and other sources. And they're saying it's being held. Well, it ain't just being held. It's being processed. And computers of a advancement that would beg a belief, even in the public arena today, and see how far it's gone there, are doing the processing and coming up with a model that says, if you want the world to go here, you do that. And then what they do is that. Hey presto.
So this is where we now have, smart products means that we're no longer really working on the product. We're simply using the product as a supply chain interface. Personalized services, we're no longer working on the service to really help you and solve problems in your life. The service is a supply chain interface for behavioral data, and that's the direction that surveillance capitalism is taking our economy.
A phrase that has become popular recently is that you're not the customer, you're the product. But you make the point that you're not really the product, you're actually the resource to be extracted.
Yes.
And what's interesting about this is that now we're getting to a point where not only are we the resource to be extracted, as you say, we're the data that leaches from our sorrow, but we are now to be increasingly guided. It's a two-way mechanism.
It's monitoring and actuation. That's what the data scientists call it. The first phase is monitoring. We can know everything through the digital surround. We can know everything. But then the data scientists describe a later phase called actuation, where we can actually use the same devices that let us know everything. We use that knowledge to now actuate real action, real behavior in the real world of people and things.
It's an interesting is not the right word. I'm trying not to be alarmist because your book's not alarmist. Like I said, it is an intimate read, and it actually has a very, I don't even want to use the word positive message because that also sounds fake. It is positive. It feels genuinely positive. But many of us have been in situations where there have been people in our lives who are somewhat manipulative. They can manipulate us a little bit. And there's an experience of being around someone like that or in a relationship with someone like that where things don't feel right. Something feels off. There is this unease. There's this anxiety. I find this to be very relatable to where we are today.
Yes.
And I feel that this is a shift where we went from this period where the entire attention was focused towards harvesting data to now where increasingly that data is being put to use in actuation. And you've, of course, used one great example, well, a few actually, two I really liked, three maybe, two with Facebook, one with the voting, and the other more pernicious with the happiness and
the emotional
sadness,
contagion.
the emotional contagion, and then the other, it more disturbing in the context of instrumentarianism, the case of Pokemon Go.
Yes.
So maybe you can also tell our listeners who aren't familiar with these case studies what they are, because I think they're significant for where we're going in this discussion.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Well, both of Facebook conducted two what they called massive scale contagion experiments. One was to see if they could affect real-world voting behavior. And in this case, it wasn't telling you who to vote for, but just getting you to go vote. So it was like a pre-Cambridge Analytica run-through on this kind of thing. And their second massive-scale contagion experiment was around seeing if they could actually change the emotional valence of a person, make you happier or make you sadder. And the whole idea here was could we use subliminal cues in the online environment to affect changes in your real life, in the real world? In one case, getting more people to go vote than would have voted without these subliminal cues. And the other case, making some people happier and making other people sadder. And when they went to write up these experiments in the scholarly journals, reputable, very reputable scholarly journals that publish these studies, the researchers, both from Facebook and from academia, boasted that not only, one, had they discovered that you could unloose an emotional contagion through the online milieu that would change real life in the real world, but two, that you could do that by continuously and comprehensively bypassing individual awareness, that people never could see it coming. They never knew it was happening.
That's the thing that's so scary, and that's what I feel like we feel in a subconscious way when we discuss this unease and this anxiety.
Yes, that's right. That's absolutely right.
This feeling of being manipulated without our knowing.
That's right. And it's right that we feel unease because it is happening. I mean, people who are on Facebook, the news feed is like a version of this all the time because the news feed is a complex algorithm. That news feed is constantly being manipulated in order to engender the maximum engagement from you on the site. So this is all an exercise in this kind of manipulation, but some of it, like these massive scale experiments, begin to show us a sense of its ambitions, not only toward just collecting our data online, but toward society itself, toward how surveillance capitalism moves toward the real world, toward organizing real populations as we move through our real lives in our cities, in our countries, in our societies, to tune and herd and coax us in the real world toward its guaranteed outcomes. And that's where Pokemon Go comes in. Pokemon Go, as you know, was an augmented reality game developed and incubated at Google, spun off at the last minute for its introduction to the world. But Pokemon Go really was a population-level experiment in how we use now this digital architecture to herd populations through the real places in our real cities toward the guaranteed outcomes that our business customers want. In the case of Pokemon Go, which was nominally owned by a company called Niantic Labs, which also came out of Google, run by John Hanke, who was behind Street View. Before that, he was behind Google Earth. Before that, he invented the satellite system that was invested in by the CIA that then was bought by Google that became Google Earth.
That's an important piece also, just to throw it in there.
Exactly.
The surveillance state component and how important 9/11 was and the terrorist attacks were to enabling this, not just on the regulatory front, but also for the culture to get to this place where people say, I don't have nothing to hide, why do I care?
Right, right. That's a key piece of this. The interests of the surveillance state were critical to incubating and nurturing, and these fledgling companies with their really cool, amazing new surveillance capabilities that bypassed awareness and so forth, and making sure that there was very little, if any, law that impeded their growth and their development, so that these capabilities would be there when the state needed to dip in, because these capabilities were allowed to grow and flourish under the auspices of private capital, free from constitutional constraints, free from other kinds of democratic law that ultimately even our intelligence agencies are accountable to. So in the case of Pokemon Go, what we saw was that at first it seemed like, how is Pokemon Go making money? Well, it's making money because people buy doodads for their Pokemon creatures, and they buy banners and they tokens to get them up to the next level of the game, and these various accessories that enhance the game. But ultimately, what became clear was that Pokemon Go, Niantic Labs, had convened its own behavioral futures markets. So it had establishments in the city, the pizza joints, the restaurants, the bars, the McDonald's franchises, the other kinds of services, places where they might, fix your car, or where you might want to go shopping. All these places were paying Niantic Labs for guaranteed footfall. So now, again, you see the exact same structure as what we talked about before in the online targeted advertising. Online targeted advertising, we're paying for a piece of future behavior, which is a click-through. Now we're in the real world, on the real streets, in the city, in the parks, in and out of homes, in and out of cars. We're paying for a piece of future behavior. This time it's not click-through, it's footfall. It's your real body in a real place, spending real money in my restaurant, in my shop, whatever it might be. So now we have come kind of full circle now to how we learn to herd populations through the real places of our real lives toward others' guaranteed commercial outcomes, all of it outside of our awareness, while we think that we're just playing Pokemon Go. And this, of course, is a rehearsal. It's a dry run for the model of the smart city, which Google calls the Google City. It's what citizens in Toronto are contesting this very day, as the public officials of Toronto have ceded to Google a part of the waterfront to develop. And Eric Schmidt, when he heard about this great coup that they had landed, said, now it's our turn. Our turn means that if it's our turn, it's private capital's turn, it's surveillance capital's turn to run the city, instead of what? Instead of democracy's turn, instead of the citizens' turn. Means that democracy's turn is up, and now it's surveillance capitalism's turn to run the city, to replace politics with computation, to replace citizens with statistics, to replace the city with the idea of a population. This is where we begin to see the economic imperatives driving an economic logic inexorably offline into the real world, beyond scale, beyond scope, into our action, into our behavior, into our society itself.
That's a terrifying image. And I know, again, we're not trying to draw comparisons, but there is, at least on an emotional level, it generates feelings and images related to a totalitarian state. I understand that it's not, but emotionally it feels overwhelming.
Well, it feels
way.
Totalitarian because it feels like a place of no escape.
Yeah.
And it feels like a place of absolutism.
Right.
Because computational truth replaces politics. And humankind is not meant to live in absolutism. Uncertainty is a feature of the human condition. And that's why we invented language, contracts, law, society, as a way of combining together and collaborating together in order to minimize the downside of uncertainty, which is inevitable in the future. And as we do that, building our trust, building our bonds, learning how to work together, learning how to solve problems. This is the social fabric. This is how social trust is created. But then if we imagine a world of computational certainty, we no longer have to do that. We no longer have to work together. We no longer have to debate and contest. We no longer have to collaborate. We no longer have to problem solve. We no longer have to put our shoulders together in the face of uncertainty and make our way to the future together. We just rely on the absolutism of the computational answer, and that becomes a new form of profoundly anti-democratic absolutism.
we're just talking about the distinctions. Totalitarianism uses force and the fear of violence that's generated from the threat of violence to compel people to moderate their behavior. This is something where the behavior is moderated by those who have the power. Instead of it being from the outside in, it's from the inside out.
Well, you're right. The whole essence of totalitarianism is that terror is used to shape behavior. But that's why I think this distinction is so important. Instrumentarian power. It's the instrumentation that is used at an arm's length to shape behavior, and you don't know it. You're not aware of it. You're not afraid of it. You're not terrified. No one is trying to cut your head off or send you to the gulag or the concentration camp. So as I've reiterated a few times now, the surveillance capitalists are very proud of the fact that these systems are designed to bypass awareness. So you never know it's happening, you never know it's coming, and therefore you are robbed of the right of combat. Resistance is annihilated at the root because we don't know that it's happening to us. So it's a slow burn. It's a slow burn. And you go out and walk on the streets outside the studio. Everybody's walking on the sidewalk, looking at their phone. Yeah. It's already in train.
So you kind of hinted at this before, and you've talked about it at length in your book, but societies of human beings are complex systems, and that's because free will is a feature of the system. The economic systems that we have today, you mentioned Hayek in the book, for example. Hayek deals with the information problem. This is what prices are for. It's because we can't perfectly know as human beings what the price of something should be, and so the market manifests that price in a sense. These economic systems that we've developed, they don't seem that they could work in this society, in this type of a system. And I also wonder, and I think you make the point in your book, I wonder also about democracy as a system. In other words, democracy requires free will also. And you point some statistics out in your book about the loss of faith in democracy in Western countries. There's also more and more talk about universal basic income. You make the point about General Motors at the height of the Great Depression employed more people than Google and Facebook at the height of their market capitalizations. I think what's clear from reading your book is that there's no way to actually live under such a system and have these systems of government and economics that we have. You devote a good deal of time in the book, I don't know that we'll get time to talk about it here, about solutions, ways of basically resisting, because you talk about it in terms of resistance. You also talk about outrage and finding our outrage and naming and shaming. And I think there are a lot of positive lessons there. I don't know if you want to comment on any of that before we go, because I know you have to get going, Professor Zuboff.
Well, you've raised so many important points, and I think the big picture here is that I mentioned at the very beginning when we were talking about the definition of surveillance capitalism that there are many ways in which surveillance capitalism seems to diverge quite dramatically from the history of capitalism. One you mentioned, like the whole idea of why do we have to have free markets? Why do we have to have free enterprise? Why all the emphasis on freedom? Going all the way back to Adam Smith. And this is the theme that Friedrich Hayek, the architect of neoliberalism, took up. The whole idea was that we can never know what is going on in the market. It's so complex that it's deeply mysterious, ineffable. And therefore, every actor has to have maximum freedom to do the best they can, to make the best judgments they can, because no one can see the totality. Well, now, in this new regime that we've been discussing, we have a situation where the totality is visible. And yet, surveillance capitalists are still demanding absolute freedom. So here's the great contradiction. What I say in the book is that they know too much to qualify for freedom. That the whole justification for freedom, for the freedom of the market, was that we cannot know.
Well, this is also, you touch on this with the divisions of learning in society, right? This is what you mean by the division of learning in society.
Yes. And so now the fact that they know too much to qualify for freedom we've entered the 21st century, which is a century in which the key principles of social order are really about the division of learning, not much less so now about the division of labor, right? It's less about what do I do than what do I know. And the key questions for the division of learning in society, who knows? Who decides who knows? Who decides who decides
These
who
are
knows?
basic philosophical questions. Who will guard the guardians?
That's right. Knowledge, authority, and power, the essential questions. So now we're entering the 21st century with these huge institutional creations of surveillance capitalism that have amassed these asymmetries of knowledge, these concentrations of knowledge that really are unprecedented in human history. They know everything about us. We know almost nothing about them. Their
That's a
knowledge
remarkable statement.
is about us, but it's not for us. So these are very peculiar, unprecedented asymmetries. And the knowledge that they have accumulated is not knowledge that they will, and in many cases even can share. Right? Because this is now embedded in these machine systems that create the predictions that drive the markets. So this is what, when Durkheim talked about the philosopher, sociologist Durkheim, who first wrote about the division of labor in society as the axial principle of the 20th century, he wrote about these things can go haywire, and you can have an abnormal division of labor where elite power takes control of the economic machinery. And things are very unequal in the way they're divided, in the way these opportunities to participate and contribute are divided. Feudal systems, elitist systems. Well, now we're finding ourselves early stages of creating the 21st century society, division of learning in society, already pathologically shaped by these deep asymmetries of knowledge and the deep asymmetries of power that accrues from that knowledge.
Power.
Right? So what this means is that in addition to economic inequality, we're introducing a whole new axis of inequality into 21st century society, which is the inequality of who knows. Who decides who knows? Who decides who decides who knows? The answer to these questions are now lodged in the terrain of the surveillance capitalists. And what I say is that is not okay. That is an intolerable situation. It's a situation that no 21st century citizen should face. And it is now up to us to name this, to grasp it, to call upon, insist upon the resources of our democratic institutions, which have largely slept while surveillance capitalism has flourished, and to insist that democracy retake the high ground. That is democracy that decides the division of learning in society. That is democracy that decides the future. That is democracy that oversees the trajectory of the digital. That is democracy that invites new competitors to take hold of the digital in ways that actually can fulfill its promise of empowerment and emancipation and democratization. Our democracies have to be reinvigorated, resuscitated in order to understand what has happened, intervene, interrupt, outlaw this new economic logic in its very specific mechanisms, so that the way is opened again, where the digital is freed from its enslavement to surveillance capitalism, if you will, from this parasite that has taken hold and hijacked it.
For listeners, in the overtime, I'm going to go through some of these solutions and some of the things that Professor Zuboff outlines in her book, because I also think there are market opportunities. You have a great quote. I think it's from actually an interview you gave. I tweeted it out. I really loved it, having to do with market opportunities, because I completely agree, and I've been making this point myself. I think there's a humongous market opportunity here because of this profound market failure in not addressing the privacy.
This is a market failure of world historic proportions, because nobody wants this.
It's an existential threat to the business models of these enormous platforms. Now, Apple is an interesting case, of course, because they've made a point to differentiate themselves from Google, and I think they're trying to take this competitive advantage, which is to say that we can offer you a platform and give you back your privacy, and by doing that, it's taking a competitive shot at Google.
So we'll see.
We'll see.
I mean, obviously, Apple has taken that stand. Tim Cook has taken that stand, but Apple is still full of many contradictions, many things that would have to be resolved. But were it to be an Apple or a company, alliance of companies, alliance of business leaders who can found a new ecosystem that really plants a flag in the ground, changes the trajectory toward the digital future. This alliance, these new operators, these new competitors have the opportunity to engage every single person on planet Earth as their customer, because nobody wants to be entangled in surveillance capitalism.
Well, I think that's where the optimism comes from. And I'm sure you've seen it because you've been touring now on your book, and you see how many people respond to this.
Yes, that's right.
I think that's what's so optimistic about this. The demand is there, and I think people are waking up because that anxiety is becoming impossible for some of us to ignore.
Absolutely right. I have every faith that we triumph here. Because, and the key thing goes back to our distinction between technology and capitalism, surveillance capitalism specifically. Our societies have experience, successful experience, in fighting and tethering the raw excesses of capitalism to the requirements of our populations, of our people, and of our democracies. We ended the Gilded Age. We did it again during the Depression. We did it again in the post-war era. We brought law, regulation, and opened the way for new forms of competition that allowed capitalism to reach an equilibrium with democracy, and we called it market democracy. And I see every possibility today as people all over the world are being activated. And the naming is a key part of that. As people are activated, politicians are being activated. I've just spent a week in Brussels, 10 days in London. I've seen it in Europe. Politicians are being activated. Political leaders are talking about surveillance capitalism. We see folks who have nominally been called users, the name given to them by surveillance capitalists, now beginning to understand we have political interests and we have economic interests, we have social and psychological interests. We want something else. The demand is there. That is going to make its way into the political system, and it's going to make its way into the market system.
Absolutely.
So I have every belief that we know how to create this change, how to take on this kind of combat and do it successfully. We've done it before. We'll do it again. This is not the end of the story. This is the beginning of the story.
I feel 100% the exact same way. Dr. Zuboff, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Dimitri.
ALC 201, Exploring New Media Module 2, Who's Watching Whom? Great. Now that we're done with that, let's get to learning. I sound like every teacher I've ever had. The person we're talking about today is this guy, Michel Foucault. It took me 5 minutes to pronounce his name correctly. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing it correctly now. But it took him 58 years to be an established philosopher and historian in France, and internationally for that matter. So he's a huge advocate of this construction, the panopticon. Let's see what I can remember from first year philosophy. You stick one central tower and then all around you have your prisoners, students, or patients, people that you basically want to keep an eye on. The prisoners know that they've been watched, but they don't know when, so they behave. At least that's the idea. The idea of the panopticon can actually be related to the Gestapo during World War II. Gestapo. I don't know how to pronounce it. I can only pronounce one thing right at a time. It would literally be a case of terrified Germans, like, not wanting to do anything wrong because they know that they would report someone if they saw something happening, so then they wouldn't do it themselves. The risk was too big. Everyone would do it. Everyone's the same. People watching people. You see the parallels that I'm making? Brilliant. I suppose Foucault's idea of the panopticon is pretty relevant, and that's the contention. There's actually a lot of debate around Foucault and his ideas, whether or not they're relevant for today's time. Is he relevant or is he redundant? Is he refined or is he redundant? Thesaurus, this is so handy. Personally, I think the idea of surveillance is terrifying, which is actually something that Adam Brown suggests, that we should see surveillance as something strange, because there's people watching us at all times. That's pretty fucking scary. It's the main reason that I wear hoodies whenever I walk around campus at night. It's also the reason why I cover up the webcam on my Mac. I don't want anyone knowing what I'm doing or recording me while I'm sleeping. In Foucault's Discipline and Punishment, he covers 4 main themes. We have torture, punishment, discipline, and prison. The first 2 are probably the most interesting because they relate to the problems that were encountered in France at the time. So you've got this sovereign power, aka France, whose custom is to inflict pain on an assailant in order to reflect the wrongdoing that they've done to society or the actual sovereign state. But what actually happened is that people would sometimes side or idolize the person who's being tortured and then try to free them or just create an all-out riot. Now this is Foucault's remedy for violent punishment in France. That idea went out the window and they introduced a different method. There is actually a school of thought that disregards the panopticon completely, saying it's irrelevant, and they bring in this idea called the synopticon. Now it's basically the panopticon but with social media aspects. There's this idea that Shoshana Zuboff introduces, another name that I can't pronounce, in her book The Age of the Smart Machine. Now, she talks about the panopticon and information technology. So, you're an office worker, you work a 9-to-5 job, and you use a set computer for all of your daily duties. The boss has installed software that actually tracks everything that you do, every keystroke, every initiation of a task, and then the end of a task. So the idea is that he's always watching. He may not be sitting at the chair watching what you're doing, like in the panopticon situation, but every single one of your actions has been recorded, so they can be drawn on at any time, and basically there's no escape. So in conclusion, Foucault's theories are completely irrelevant for today's society. They haven't been outdated at all, regardless of the school of thought, although they do bring up a lot of good points. For example, there's the idea that the synopticon, unlike what I just said, is actually a replacement for the panopticon instead of a kind of fine-tuned version of it. Also, in the fantastically named Zygmunt Bauman, I think I got it right, he wrote this essay called On Postmodern Use of Sex, and that basically criticizes the whole idea of the panopticon, saying that it has moved on to the idea of seduction. Thank you for your time. Probably was. I cite my sources.